Hi, and welcome to Making Waves on Purpose. I'm Jeff Senny, and today we're joined by Grady Lee. Grady works at Social Marks and Give to Get, two enterprises focused on helping companies live their purpose and move from talk to action. And we have a wide-ranging conversation that covers PE and their role in the economy and corporate social responsibility, reporting, and identity within companies. Rich, flowing conversation that I think you'll really enjoy. And with no further ado, I give you Grady Lee. Hey, Grady, thanks for joining us.
Good to be here, Jeff.
So tell us, what are you up to these days?
Well, quite a bit, it seems. I know everybody talks about this, but coming out of the pandemic, you never were quite sure how the world was going to be, but it's gotten busy for us. So we do two big chunks, two big avenues of work that I'm doing. One is with a company called Give to Get, which we help companies put their purpose in motion. We help to engage companies on an actionable purpose, and then we try to get that off the PowerPoint and on its feet with its people, its consumers, its suppliers. And so we go engage, global Fortune 500 companies in kind of community engagement, employee engagement, consumer engagement around purpose, around social impact. And so it takes us to a lot of interesting places. It's a growth business, certainly over the last coming out of COVID. Everybody wants to get back in front of each other. They want to get some work done. They want to come together, even though social media may tell you opposite. People do want to engage and help. So we've seen a huge kind of growth in that part of our business. And then the other avenue we're going down is around data. So the other thing that happened during the COVID bit is we had a lot of time on our hands. When you start running events and you do big global engagements and all of a sudden nobody can convene or get together, you have a lot of time on your hands waiting for all of that to pass. So we started looking at a lot of this ESG conversation happening online and in the investor community and the social movements that were happening at the time. And we started saying, well, what do we know about ESG? And the thing we knew the best about was the social part, because we had been doing it for so long. So we said, well, let's see if we can create some definition around that. So we created a company called Social Marks to try to be an action-based metric for companies coming up against ESG regulations who are trying to outcompete for customers and employees. It's kind of what is their overall social license to operate? How are they acting on their values? And how are they investing in it? And try to put that in a competitive framework so that we get companies competing on things that help society in a way that is kind of business friendly, but also makes a difference. So, we're trying to get the physical, kind of get your hands dirty side of the business. And then we've got kind of the data driven side of the world. And we're trying to get people to do things in both contexts.
That's fabulous. And tell me how you developed the methodology. Tell us about the methodology for Social Marks and how companies are using it.
Yeah, well, there are two main questions that we were trying to answer, and we get asked a lot around coming out of the Give to Get stuff. And when we were talking to people about their purpose, one was, is this any good? Like, is what I'm doing any good? And it's a question that kind of anybody wants to know, frankly, and somebody new in their job, somebody who's been there a long time. And because what happens is when they read about things in the press, everybody's comparing themselves to Ben and Jerry's and Patagonia and the like, and say, well, I'm not Patagonia. I'm an industrial manufacturer of equipment. I'm not going to be Patagonia. And so we said, well, we need to put this in a competitive context. Nobody fights against everyone. You kind of compete against 15 to 20 companies that you compete for market share. You compete for employees. You compete for, that's your metric, right? And it's this competitive framework that we try to put this in because we believe competition works. And if people are engaged in a competitive kind of thing on something that helps community and society and their people, we think that provides some extra motivation, and it moves from I should do this to I have to do this, because now it's about my business. And so So the first thing we wanted to do was not talk about absolute measures. We really wanted to find competitive cohorts. Let people define who they want to compete against along some metrics, and let's drive action that way. The second bit is around action. So over the last 25, 30 years, we have been trying to get people to do things and trying to get them to not just talk about what they care about, but how do you actually get your hands dirty and do it? And so we wanted to collect basically decision points that companies make. Am I going to, for instance, how do I invest in my people, right? I don't want, there's a little bit of room for statements and goals, but what's my gender pay gap? What's my diversity mix in the company? Do I have a training program? Am I investing in my people? We go into the brand side. How am I using my products, my services, my sponsorship dollars, my marketing dollars? How am I investing in community? Not necessarily, we found that a lot of the stuff in the S was a bunch of found data. The environment side is pretty well covered. It's carbon. It's probably could be some more attention spent on water and other externalities. But the social stuff was such a mishmash and unrecognizable that we decided to focus in there and basically tried to not even really score it as a score, but only score it in order to rank it and to rank things on a competitive basis so that if you look at actionable things, decisions and strategies that are actually happening, compare those against other strategies and actions that are actually happening, then you can go to the CEO and says, we're at the bottom of the list. And there are 5 things we can actually do to be better, as opposed to some person I don't know has evaluated our world and they've given us a low score. I don't know what to do with that. So we always wanted to have at least action to be able to come out of it. So we just really take raw data. Most of the data is really kind of direct data. About 50% of social marks is just the number, percentages, dollars, the like. About 40% of the data is binary. Do you have X or do you not have X, right? And then about 10% is assessed, where we kind of try to look at the depth of reporting, how you're doing it. Is it innovative compared to what we look at? But that's a small part of it. And then we just try to line them up. It's amazing what you can see when you just line things up next to each other. You really get kind of heights and weights of investment. And so we like the cleanliness of the methodology and what it actually can show.
That's fabulous. And can you give us an example of like how companies are then using it? I mean, you talked a little bit about, I'm talking to the CEO and we're not competitive in this space or that space, and here's some things we can do. It sounds like they're using it kind of as a management model.
It is a big management tool, but the first instance it was supposed to be a management tool, because we find that, the first cut of it, you'll see that some people report on this stuff and some people don't. And the way we get our data primarily is through public. It's just public data. Are you reporting on it? Is it in government databases? Is it just kind of out lying around? It's a lot of disorganized data. So we try to organize it and put it in a spot. And so we find that first part is half of your competition is reporting on this and you're not. So you can just kind of start talking about it or not, or don't, but know that's kind of what's happening. When people come see you, this is how you show up. So we're looking at kind of how people appear. But I will say that, one example of how a company has used it, we did a piece of work for a private equity firm. And they were a 25, 30-year private equity firm. They've been very successful. They're in the kind of defense, environmental industry space. And 2 things started happening to them. One was, it was kind of all the social protests during 2020, George Floyd and the like, and some of their younger employees kind of came up to management and said, what are you guys going to do about this? And the management team, middle-aged, successful white dudes, said, what do you mean, what am I going to do about that? I don't know what to do about this. He said, well, you got to do something. And so there was pressure from below to be or just to acknowledge or be or act a certain way. The next thing that was happening, they were having another raise. And one of their big LPs, like I don't know, the Canadian Pension Fund or something of the like came to them and said, I've been giving you money for 20 years. I can't do it anymore. And they said, whoa, why not? I said, well, you're a bunch of old white guys. And I have procurement issues. I have to start investing in different things. They were like, okay, well, wait a minute. So we started talking to them and I said, let's go look at the defense. If that fund wants to invest in defense and environmental industry, let's see how you're doing, right? It's if you like the returns of the industry, then compare me against the alternative. Don't compare me against some almighty number. So we ran a social marks report. They gave us their competitive set. We ran a social marks report, and they found that they were in the top half of that set in a lot of ways and had some very specific ways they could get higher. And they went back to the fund and said, this is us comparatively. And they said, oh, good, thanks. And they got their $250 million. So it was a procurement tool, right? Which is another just a big asset in the social impact space, is to be able to communicate yourself on a procurement basis. But it also helped to go through the process with their employees, because their employees said, all right, so now we've got a plan. Now we know exactly where we are. And then the management, we did a little purpose kind of compass set about what direction they should go and what they should be about, so that they could communicate that both outwardly and inwardly. But the social marks kind of report showed gaps, showed places where they were better than they thought, and allowed them to kind of tout their strengths and kind of mitigate their weaknesses over time. And so, again, it provided a way forward as opposed to just a browbeating of what. And it was a private thing. We just sent it to them. And so it wasn't in the press or anything, but it really drove change within that company. And I find the private equity industry, talk about moving money around. There's a lot of influence with a very small amount of people. So I find that some of those small and mid-sized companies can use social marks in a way. And we've been talking to the larger, Fortune 500 about it. It's gone a little slower, honestly, because they say, we do that already. And they've got research teams and they've got, they're kind of entrenched in a lot of ways. But we're kind of continuing to go down that road, because I do think they're not as good as they think they are. And I don't think anybody's really happy with any of it. And so we still think there's an opportunity there. What we're trying to do now is to broaden this social data lake so that we get a broader, deeper look at a lot of this social data. And then we can start looking at trends and forecasting where are people going to be and based on where they've been. And I think there's a lot of opportunity there.
I think this is fascinating because, you talked a lot about communications, but there's also this idea of like green hushing happening right now. There's some ESG pushback and whatnot. So this may help, because a lot of what you're talking about is storytelling. And I'm fascinated by how little companies know about themselves on many of these issues. Are you finding that?
Oh, yes, because the data is disparate and it's not in one place, and nobody compares it across. It's never apples to apples, right? And in the early days of the environmental bits, there was a lot of kind of CO2 emissions per gigabit there were all of these kind of varying metrics between companies that it was a mess. And I think that's what's happening a bit on the social. And it is, they know what they're doing, but they don't really know what everybody else is doing. So it's kind of like, I think I'm really fast at the mile until I get with other people running the mile. And, then it turns out I'm not as fast as I thought I was. And so I don't think I think good is and how you're doing is a relative measure. And when it comes to kind of business, right? And, how big you are is really depending upon who you're standing next to. So I just think it's a comparative opportunity to drive some momentum. And a quick note on the ESG thing, I kind of, all of the pushback on ESG, I think is not unwarranted. I think there's some truth in the fact that it is, it gets a little insane. And ESG in and of itself was created not by people who do social impact. Or even environmental impact. It was a financial tool, again, made up kind of data points, and let's kind of market it and use it. And all of a sudden it became a cudgel and it became I think it lost its overall meaning because you could argue it down. We start talking about social marks as competitive social intelligence. How do I know what kind of company I am from a people standpoint compared to everybody else? And so, the ESG thing is pretty easy to bang up at the moment. But I just think it's the letters. I think everybody knows that they need to do this. And if they can, I think they would do the work as long as they didn't have to say ESG ever again.
That's interesting. Yeah, I think that's right in a lot of ways. And I love what you said too about private equity and how big of an influence. I read an article yesterday that said, something in the last 30 years, it went from 3% of the economy to now 20% of the economy is in the PE space. And, there's some benefits to that and there's some challenges with that. And one of the challenges this article went into is how opaque that space can be, and probably for us and for them.
Oh, sure. This is a little bit of dark humor, but the income inequality and kind of the concentration of wealth in kind of business and industry and people and class and the whole thing. The only good thing there is now you know where the money is and now you know where to look, right? So I think if this crazy concentration of wealth and power in certain industries are like, well, now let's go in there and figure out what's going on in there, right? I think certainly in the private equity, you see new private equity firms, they are centered on this idea of who we are as a company, not just our returns are going to get returns, but this is who we are. This is what we do. So you find the new ones have this really well defined. And I think you have the really big ones. They also have it defined. There's a massive middle market who's been kind of able to operate without doing it for 20 years. And now they've got to readjust because I think, again, they're getting pressure from both sides of their kind of environment. And it's an interesting time. And I'd be curious to see the economy shifts and things kind of swing. You wonder whether, I know PE firms are having trouble raising again at the moment because it's just tricky times. But I think that, I don't know, the pendulum always swings somewhere. But who you are as a company is becoming just as important as what you do as a company. And I think that's hopefully something that helps us.
Yeah, I think that's right. I've been doing a lot of thinking about like how lessons in personal identity actually translate into lessons in corporate identity, and how much of our personal identity is actually not of our own choosing. You're much more likely to be a Republican if you grew up in a Republican household, and vice versa. You're much more likely to be Catholic if you grew up Catholic, if you, which are major pillars of our identities. And I think a lot of that is true for companies too. And I think we continue to talk about purpose, and I'm glad we talk about purpose because I think it's critical, but it's not at the expense of profit and that identity, which is alive and well in companies. And we shouldn't disparage, because that has done amazing things. I mean, it's created essentially the middle class. 400 years ago, everybody was poor.
Yeah, it's a must.
Yeah.
Something you said before about kind of, you're much more likely to be X if you did Y. There's a great study by Robert Putnam, the social scientist who wrote Bowling Alone. And he wrote his latest book, he looked at classrooms. He started getting into youth and kind of what made youth rise. And one of the things which I thought was fascinating was, if you look at a classroom, kids, the background and makeup of the people around you are more indicative of your outcomes than your own background. So who you are around is more important than who you are. And it kind of goes back to what, that old kind of thing your grandmother used to say, like, don't hang around with a bad crowd. But if you are surrounded by people of a certain makeup and certain drive, a certain whatever, that's more indicative of your outcome than if I came from an environment of drive and certain kind of makeup. So what you're saying is our environments really do matter. And certainly we have some inherent traits and whatnot, but they get activated in different ways depending upon where you are. And so really defining kind of who you're competing against, I think, for a company really sets a tone for who you are. Are we competing against kind of good social operators? Are we competing against, race to the bottoms and we're going to get rich as quick as we can? And we trying to be a long-term bit, or are we just doing a quick race for something else? So I do think that environmental kind of who you are around and who you compare yourself to, who you compete against, has huge impacts on kind of who you are from an individual as well as a corporate setting.
Well, and I think we were talking about PE, and PE has traditionally been that short race towards profit, but you're seeing that change, at least in tone and tenor, if not in behavior. And I think that's a critically important, given how much of the economy PE now is invested in. So what do you see coming around the horizon? Things that people should be thinking about?
Well, I think that, and it's not necessarily around the corner, but it's kind of, you can see it coming up. I think people are tired of talking about things and they want to do things. And I find that there's some fatigue in posturing. I think there's some fatigue in talking too much and not doing enough. I think people want to see action from themselves, from their community, from the companies that they work for and buy from. I mean, I'm certainly, the competition for talent is robust right now because, unemployment's fairly low. And so the good people can go wherever they want. And so I think defining who you are as an employer is becoming key. And there's a lot of articles like nobody cares about ping pong and foosball and cafeteria as much. They want to know what's the social fabric of the company. What are we doing? Are we helping? Are we hurting? Do we take care of each other? Is this a place where I can grow? Is this a place that helps my personal brand? Right? Nobody wants to work for an asshole. So I don't want to do that either. And so I think there's a lot of the kind of blending of the work-life balance nonsense. It's all becoming a thing, right? We're kind of working from home. We're constantly, you're trying to get employee engagement programs so employees will tout their company successes. And it's all kind of becoming meshed up. And I think one of the things in the CSR space and the social impact space from a company standpoint, I find that the biggest chasm that is such a mystery to me, it's just entrenched in habit, is the difference between kind of engaging your employees and engaging your consumers. I find that when we deal with kind of CSR teams, meeting and events, employee engagement and HR, I might as well be on Mars when I go talk to the marketing and branding and communications team. They don't know each other. They don't like each other. They don't speak the same language. But the line between employee and consumer, or an employee at a different time of day as a consumer, and vice versa, it's all the same thing. And how companies are represented in the marketplace affects your talent and your churn and your retention. It affects your customer acquisitions. There's a great study at Starbucks a while ago. I don't think this way anymore, but they did a study that said consumers liked them more the better they treated their employees, because there was such a personal relationship with your barista and your local shop. That's why they started offering, free college and things of that sort, because, people liked being a part of that. And now Starbucks has changed a lot. Everything's changed a lot, but that was a pretty good insight. I think that probably is more true than not, especially if it's known. I started seeing a lot of television advertising around, come work for us. We're a cool company. Amazon does this a lot because they need to hire a lot of people. They're running media campaigns for hiring people. McDonald's on the best first job, and this is what it's like to work here, and the GE thing. And, I just think that kind of blending of media and kind of attention and how you talk about yourself, I think is going to start to blend in a way that's going to force departments to go have lunch and talk about how to do this together. Because I think there's two things. The CSR team cannot compete against a marketing budget, because that marketing budget is renewable. It's 10 times as big. It gets spent 10 times as quickly, but it needs to be spent quickly. And so, a lot of times the foundations and the CSR teams, they want to take some time. They want to make sure it's right. Meanwhile, the marketing part, I got to get out $500 million by the end of the quarter, right? And then on the marketing side, they're looking for truth and authenticity about who they are. The brand conversation about who you are cannot come solely from the marketing department. It's got to come from who they actually are. Otherwise, that thing doesn't quite, one more story on that. You think about the Wells Fargo years ago when Wells Fargo had that whole problem where they were opening up double accounts for people and just to hit some numbers. And then, the world came crashing down on them, new CEO and the like. And then they ran, $500 million campaign to say we're relaunching Wells Fargo. There were billboards up across Los Angeles and everywhere else. Launched in 17 something and then relaunched in 2006. Well, I think like 6 months later, there was an article on the front page of the New York Times that said, Wells Fargo says it's changed, but its employees say not so much. And 2 months later, that CEO's in front of Congress again. He gets fired and they got to do it all over again. So I just find that your source of authenticity and power comes from inside the company. It doesn't come from a whiteboard at a brand agency.
Couldn't agree more. I just read an article that this idea like the customer is always right is exactly wrong. That if you put your employees first, they'll put your clients first. They'll put your customers first.
That's right. And Ritz Carlton does this amazing well, right? They give almost, I think I read every employee $1,000 to go fix a problem, from the janitor to the front desk.
They also, I was in the hospitality industry for years, and I was always impressed with Ritz because at least back then, every employee when they were on duty had to carry this little trifold piece of paper, like a business card on them. And it was their credo. It was ladies and gentlemen serving ladies and gentlemen. And the thing that I loved about it is it set the expectation both on the employee and the customer, that both sides of this equation needed to treat each other respectfully and blah, blah, blah. And I thought, what a really interesting way in setting a purpose or, a credo or a mission or whatever you want to call it, like saying this is what we stand for and how that then changed people's behaviors as a result. I think it's exactly right. And you said, marketing needs to be truthful and authentic. And I think much of it is not. And to your point, like the money has to get shoveled out. I'm reminded of the famous saying, half of all marketing works. We just don't know which half. And yet we don't have the same latitude in corporate responsibility budgets. Every dollar is meant to make impact and to show this. And I just had a conversation with Andrew Winston on this, that, why is it that we twist ourselves in knots on the business case on these issues, and we don't expect the same from many of our other investments in companies. Right. So a lot more to talk about, but I'm super grateful of you joining us today, and thanks for all you're doing.
Oh man, I appreciate the opportunity. I don't get to opine about this very often, so it's good to talk to somebody who's into it and interested. So I thank you for it too.
Yep, a pleasure. Take care.
Bye.